In this section of my presentation, we will look at the relationship of animal protein intake and various chronic diseases. Is there a difference in protein from different sources? Particularly, is there a difference between proteins from animals and plants? I think it's fair to say that we have been trained to think that there is. We have been taught that proteins from animals are better or higher quality. This term comes from agriculture, and in that context it means that some feeds per weight make animals grow faster. A more accurate way to put this is that animal protein is more biologically efficient. It makes sense that proteins in the bodies of other animals are more similar to the proteins in our bodies, or that the mix of amino acids in their protein is similar to the mix of amino acids in our proteins. Generally, the mix of amino acids in plant proteins is slightly different. A protein from a certain plant source may be missing one or other amino acid, which is to say that plant protein is less biologically efficient. On the surface, this sounds like a bad thing, but the very efficient growth caused by animal protein also encourages cells to grow in abnormal and excess ways, and this is what we call cancer. Two proteins that are particularly biologically efficient and used in a lot of studies because they are easily available are casein, which is one of the main proteins in milk, and albumin, which is one of the main protein in eggs. We were brought up thinking milk and eggs are especially good for us, helping us to grow big and strong, but perhaps there are some downsides to that. Let me give you some background on that. This slide describes a study that was first reported in India in 1968 and was repeated several times since. Back around the time this study was done, it was felt that malnutrition in the developing world wasn't just a lack of calories, it was especially due to a lack of protein, and there were particular projects created to find ways to increase protein availability in these countries. In the course of these studies, it was picked up that there was a kind of relationship between dietary protein and a contaminant in peanuts and liver cancer, particularly an unusual form of liver cancer that affected children. In the study represented on this slide, a large amount of substance that was a contaminant found in peanuts called aflatoxin was fed to a group of rats. Then some of the rats were given what was considered a regular protein diet consisting of 20% casein or milk protein, and some rats were given what was considered a low-protein diet consisting of 5% casein. The assumption of the researchers was that the low-protein rats wouldn't do as well because they were malnourished, but what in fact they saw was that all of the rats in the 20% casein diet died of liver cancer, and none of the rats in the 5% group died of liver cancer. It turns out this wasn't a chance finding. This study has been repeated by other researchers in many ways since. Here's another example. This slide describes an experiment that was reported on in 1992. It was done in the labs of Dr. Colin Campbell, who is a respected nutrition biochemist in the United States, who spent a large part of his career exploring cancer and protein. In this study, a group of rats were fed aflatoxin like in the previous study. Then for 3 weeks they were given a diet of 20% casein, and the cancer cells in their livers started to multiply. Then they were put on a 5% casein diet for 3 weeks, and their livers had a decrease in cancer cells. Then they were fed a 20% casein diet, and the liver cancer cells started increasing again, and so on. The results of this study suggest some very good news. It suggests that even if we have abnormal cells in our bodies, we may be able to decrease the chances of them becoming cancer by changing our diet. You might ask, what if a diet high in plant protein was fed to the rats? These studies were repeated with soy and wheat protein, and it was found that plant proteins did not promote cancer growth. On this slide, we can see the results of a study that compared the amount of food eaten from animal sources in relation to the amount of breast cancer in various countries. We can see that as animal food intake increases, the amount of breast cancer increases. And as you can see here, relative to other countries, Canada's intake of animal-based food and rate of breast cancer is quite high. This slide represents a study that was reported in a journal called Meat Science, which we can assume contains articles that support the idea of meat consumption. It is titled Red Meat and Colon Cancer. Should we become vegetarians, or can we make meat safer? The article states that with red meat consumption, there is an increased risk of colon cancer. In this segment of my presentation, I have showed you studies that have found links that have been identified between eating animal-sourced proteins and cancer. We have seen that there is strong evidence that animal protein promotes cancer development. These effects are seen in amounts of protein that are usual in an average North American diet. This area has been studied in detail, and there are many confirmed mechanisms that explain how casein and other animal proteins promote cancer. Dr. Colin Campbell, as I have mentioned, is an eminent cancer researcher in the United States. He has stated the following: "We clearly showed that of all of the chemical carcinogens tested in the government's chemical carcinogenesis testing program, and using the traditional criteria to decide what is a carcinogen, casein, and very likely most other animal-based proteins, was the most relevant. This is not a debatable subject, and the implications of this conclusion are staggering in so many ways." So far, we have discussed animal protein and cancer. Are there links to other chronic diseases? Osteoporosis is a condition where the structure of the bones is weakened, leading to fractures. When animal protein is broken down in our bodies, it creates a small increase in acidity. The acid balance of our system is very tightly regulated and must be addressed rapidly. One most available solution we have is taking calcium from our bones to buffer this extra acidity, leading to osteoporosis. This slide describes a study that was reported from a university in Sweden. It states that the countries with the highest prevalence of osteoporosis are Sweden and Norway. This slide describes the geographic variation in osteoporotic fractures in different countries. It reports that hip fracture rates are highest in Scandinavian countries and lowest in African countries. This graph describes the same information. Each bar represents a continent. The bar on the left represents Europe and shows that in the country with the highest fracture rate, there are almost 1,000 fractures per 100,000 people. The bar on the right represents Africa. Here the fracture rate is approximately 100 per 100,000 people, or 1/10 the rate. This slide shows the per capita milk consumption in countries around the world. The darkest blue color represents milk consumption of from 281 to 361 kilograms of milk per person per year. The lightest color represents consuming less than 37 kilograms of milk per year. As we can see, the darkest blue color is seen in the Scandinavian countries and a few other countries, and the lightest color can be seen in many African countries. We need to keep in mind that this association between dairy consumption and osteoporosis does not prove a cause, but it at least should lead us to question the information that we are so often given, which is that we should drink more milk to prevent osteoporosis. Okay, so far we have discussed an association between animal protein and two chronic conditions, cancer and osteoporosis. Is there anything else to consider? Research has shown that as people increase their animal source food or meat, that they develop more kidney stones. You are probably aware that animal foods contain higher amounts of saturated fat than all but a few plant foods, and increased saturated fat increases cardiovascular disease. There is also research linking the development of autoimmune diseases to animal source foods. This is a list of the most common autoimmune diseases in North America. Some you may be familiar with, such as hypothyroid conditions or hyperthyroid conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, and type 1 or juvenile onset diabetes. Others are less common, but as a group they have a huge impact on people's lives. This is just one slide to illustrate some of the studies done on autoimmune diseases. Its title is The Role of Meat in the Expression of Rheumatoid Arthritis, and it summarizes that meat may be a major factor contributing to the inflammation of rheumatoid arthritis.